Hello everybody, good afternoon from London and welcome to the first SIGA webinar series in partnership with Soccerex, the leading football business event in the world, heading into their 25th birthday. The title of today's discussion, just a little topic, COVID 360, where does football go now? I'm Amanda Davis, getting used to the somewhat new normal, going live from my office here at home rather than the studio. But of course, I'm not the only one, am I, adjusting to this new scenario. So many of us across all aspects of sports are adjusting and readjusting to what seems to be an ever-changing and very different sporting landscape. For once, sport and football is not the exception to the rule. It has had to follow the rules during this global pandemic. And now with thousands of competitions and matches all over Europe, across the world, cancelled or postponed, with stadiums left empty, end of season battles and title races left in limbo, we're asking, what comes next? How does football move forwards? And that is everybody. That is across the board. That is players, clubs, leagues, confederations, fans, broadcasters, sponsors, so many stakeholders, so many questions to be answered, aren't there? And how much are we missing football? Well, you get some indication by just how many people have signed up and are here with us today. Hello, welcome. Watching and listening, 700 registrations from across the globe. Thank you for joining us for what we hope is going to be a great discussion. The panel, I'm sure you all know. Please welcome Michele Centenaro, General Secretary of the European Club Association, EMANUEL MACEDO de MEDEIROS, CEO of SIGA, the Sport Integrity Global Alliance, JONAS BAER-HOFFMAN, Secretary General of FIFPro, and LARS-CHRISTER, President of the European Leagues. We, as I'm sure you expect, will kick off the conversation, but there is going to be the chance for your questions at the end. So please do send them in using the live chat throughout the webinar. I will be selecting and answering as many as we can during the last 15 minutes or so. Don't forget to let us know who you are, where you are, and who the question is directed to. But without further ado, to kick things off, I'm going to start with Emmanuel from SIGA. Emmanuel, why is it that you've taken this initiative of this webinar, and why this not small topic?
Thank you, Amanda, and delighted to see you and be with all the friends here joining in this conversation. Obviously, the situation that we are living is truly exceptional. I've never seen the word unprecedented being used so often, but there is no better word to describe the crisis that we are facing. It's a health crisis, it's an incoming economic crisis, and it will be, if we do not act swiftly, a crisis in confidence. I think the world is changing. All economic sectors are shut down or pretty much hit by the adverse impact of the global health pandemic. And we, as a global organization that brings together all the sides of the industry, from governments to leagues, to other sports organizations, from global sponsors to international organizations, we needed to be active. And we needed, again, here to try to lead by example and galvanize the whole industry to, rather than to react, but to adopt a forward-thinking, a forward-looking perspective and discuss the problems, but mainly focus on the solutions, because this is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of a new phase, and it's up to us to shape it in a positive way.
Yeah, there is so much to talk about. Let's, before we look forward, maybe just try and assess where we are. What has the impact of this coronavirus pandemic been on the professional football sector and the different stakeholders that we've been talking about? Lars-CHRISTER, let me start with you. Can you attempt to sum up the impact from a league perspective?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to say health is, of course, our priority. So that's important when we are giving our views from our perspective. It's always taking the health into consideration, of course, and following the advices from the different governmental organizations and around Europe. Now, I think the most important thing is that this is probably the biggest thing or biggest crisis happening to football since World War II. So it's a totally new situation for all of us. And there is a risk for the sport itself, of course, and the most imminent result of the crisis is, of course, the worries about the finances and if clubs are going to survive or not. So that is, I think, the main question and the most important one.
Yeah, so let me then throw it over to Michele. What we have seen here, without doubt, is the gap between rich and poor, the spectrum that we're talking about here with football. Can you therefore can you generalize the impact on clubs?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, let me join LARS-CHRISTER in a first consideration about human suffering and devastation we are witnessing these days. I come from Italy, so I've experienced it very closely. So I think in the name of the football industry, it's good to say that we feel the pain and the suffering everyone. I think it's also a way to say, joining LARS-CHRISTER, that health comes first, and this is really the key principle. I also agree with LARS-CHRISTER that this is definitely an existential threat. Maybe not for football as such, but certainly for many parts of the movement. And I'm thinking in particular at the clubs now, from my perspective, which, as you say, are probably the crucial gear of the whole industry chain. And your question was whether there was a difference or a gap of impact. Well, I would say no, in the sense that I think the clubs, together with the players, because clubs and players are inherent, they belong to the same party, they are the ones suffering the most. And this goes from really top to middle to small clubs and even to amateur level, because when there is no football, then there is no spectacle, there's no players playing, there's no production of anything. And this has an impact across the whole set of clubs, be them top players, so relying very much on broadcast income, be it also amateurs, just enjoying the play, and being also clubs who, for example, are developer of players, whereby the value of the players' value is dramatically going down due to this recession. So, to answer your question, I think this is an impact which definitely goes across the whole pyramid.
Which brings me on to Jonas nicely. Michele there talks about the clubs and the players being together. But could there be an argument that this scenario has damaged the relationship between players and clubs in some way?
Well, before I get into this, and I mean, it's not something you say because it has to be said. I think it's important that as football, and probably many football people listening and watching this year, we of course all take what happens to football as a social part of who we are, but also economically very serious. But let's be very clear. I think that football as such is not more important than anything else that's happening in society right now. And that's why, from our perspective, of course, when we look at this, we look at it very much from the human side, because we represent players not because they are great football players, but because they're human beings with needs and concerns like anybody else. And well, my perspective is maybe a little bit different in the sense that we're representing a global group of individuals. And so we've looked at this from the very start in Asia, coming to Europe, where it is hitting very hard, of course, right now. But we're also looking at the evolutions of this into the Americas and into Africa. And coming to your question, it depends very much on which example you look at. The one thing that this crisis so far in our sector has brought out is that we see the best measures taken to manage the initial crash and the initial shock of this situation, where clubs and player unions have worked together most effectively. That's where actually reasonable and socially acceptable standards have been created. And we hope that that sets up something that helps the governance of our game moving forward, also when this crisis is over. At the same time, is no pointing into any other direction that there have been very, very aggressive unilateral measures taken by some clubs, by some federations as well. This is not only always on the club side, which have incredibly detrimental impact, not on players, again, as footballers, but as fathers and as husbands or wives who are trying to support their families. And globally speaking, of course, we are representing players who on average are far away from those that you see on Champions League broadcasts or Premier League broadcasts. They're on very modest salaries, and for them to be facing this threat of possibly losing their careers, not receiving their salaries, is not more damaging to the general population, but it's also not very different. It's a very real life threat. And yeah, we're trying to help them in that as good as we can, but it requires some collective thinking and responsibility to the humans who are part of this football ecosystem.
That's a very interesting point, though, collective thinking, isn't it? I mean, from Emmanuel, from your perspective, how much has it shown up, the lack of collective leadership within football and the fact that there are so many different parties involved here?
Well, in my opinion, given the amount of pain, the enormous uncertainty about the future, if there was a moment where leadership has to emerge, it is now, where consensus have to be built, where what unites us prevails over what we disagree here or there. And I think this calls for a collective responsibility, for social responsibility, and for every stakeholder to put aside what is irrelevant and focus on what is essential. And essential is now to respond to this global pandemic crisis, which will have, or we already feel it, a huge detrimental impact in global economy. There are business sectors that are completely shut down, not just sport. Take the tourism, take civil aviation, unthinkable. So this is a call for arms. This is the moment of truth. This is where we need to be the best we can and be constructive, solution-oriented, and very pragmatic. And I think we have seen examples of this maturity in terms of leadership in sport. Quickly, UEFA has brought together all key stakeholders to address the problems and come with bridges and solutions for the future. I believe my dear friends can confirm what I'm saying. Also, the expression of solidarity that we have seen, the human suffering that this is causing is unspeakable. But there has been also best examples of what mankind can do in moments of adversity. The players themselves, mobilizing themselves to generate fundraising for hospitals, for the national health systems, to help each other in this moment of adversity. The clubs are doing the same. The leagues are doing the same. I think this crisis has exposed the problems, the gaps, the lacks of leadership that we occasionally see from the political sphere to the football pitch, but also it has brought up the best we have as human beings. And I think this is something that we need to focus. I understand that we are all shocked with the number of people that die on a daily basis, with the over 300 million cases of people infected and suffering, with the mental and psychological trauma that this is creating. But I think this is also a moment where we have to face it pragmatically and shape the way forward. There is no other way. The only way to predict the future is to start today doing the right thing. And I think that in all the organizations that we invited to have this discussion, the forefront of the professional football industry, we have the example of people with experience, with leadership and commitment to unite rather than to divide. And that's my appeal to all of them, of course.
Jonas, though, Emmanuel there saying sport, UEFA acted quickly. From what you were saying in terms of you have seen this develop across the planet, you've dealt with players based in Asia. Do you agree with that, or was European football caught off guard with this?
Well, let's be fair to everybody out there. I think all of our societies were unprepared. And that's probably where the thinking needs to start, that there are smarter people than any of us on this video chat now who've been forecasting that these kinds of pandemics will happen to humankind, and we haven't listened to them. And that's not us as football people, that's us as citizens. So I think all of us have been caught off guard, and football is no different. I think what we've seen is that we had relatively fast decision in what I call the shock phase of this pandemic. And we're now working into probably the second phase of this evolution, which is a little bit, we're managing the status quo in an incredible set of uncertain factors. We don't know when governments are able to manage the reinfection rates to the degree that we all hope for societies to get this under control. We don't know whether we will hit a second wave of explosion of infections. We all don't know this, and we're trying to manage within this sphere. What I would be appealing to sitting here in the context of leadership is that I'm thoroughly convinced that those parts of, whether it's social sectors or whether it's industries or whatever you want to look at, those of us who are able to, in the time of this crisis, manage to build a plan for what we want to be once we get out of the crisis are the ones who will be strengthened. And I think all of us, it's very easy to fall into the rhythm of putting out fires because there are so many. And for us, that's no different. I mean, there's 50,000 players and probably half of them are already under enormous duress. So we're putting out fires wherever we can. But I think as institutions sitting here with some of the international leaders of these groups, we need to find the space to think how we rebuild football coming out of this, because it will be different. And it will probably in many areas be smaller from an economic perspective. But that doesn't mean that it has to be weaker overall. There are opportunities where we can build strength out of this. And that's, again, that's not football, that's society. But I think we have a responsibility for us to try to find these platforms on which we can build something that is more sustainable, that is hopefully more equal. When we look at the women's game, which is under enormous threat, which is hopefully more just. When we look at the players who are really suffering hard, and which is more sustainably economically, because we're seeing obviously right now that the economic model that we've chosen for our sector is not very capable to deal with any kind of crisis of this nature, which we're facing for the first time. So hopefully we learn from that and build something that helps us keep football strong and play its role in society that many people are obviously hoping for it to play when we get out of this.
Okay.
Dear Amanda, can I intervene?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I think I agree with Jonas that it's important to look for the future, but we have to take care of what the present also. And this is where we are standing right now, and we have to take decisions now on the situation as it is. And the big problem, I mean, for us as being leagues, we are organizing the domestic competitions, and the same problems for the international bodies when it comes to the international competitions. We have to manage a situation where each country in Europe has got their own rules and regulations. Each country is addressing the matter. I mean, if we're now talking about football, addressing, for example, if football is going to resume and finalize their competitions, or how football is going to be played. And there are governmental interventions in some countries now. So it's not easy to manage these different scenarios with all this uncertainty. So I think we have to concentrate to handle the situation now before we discuss too much about the future. I agree that there should be a lot of learnings from this crisis, but let's manage the problem we have in front of us first, and then turn to the learnings and how we are going to organize ourselves for the future. Because I have to say, the initiatives by UEFA and the stakeholders have already been quite successful in the way of coordinating things as well as it's possible in the current situation. But when you are getting a surprise that the Prime Minister is suddenly declaring how football is going to be played in a certain country and trying to get that coordinated with the international competitions and what's happening in other countries, also neighboring countries, for example, it's not that easy. So we have to be extremely flexible. And I think that football has shown that we are quite flexible, where the leagues and the clubs and the players and the governing bodies are sitting together trying to find solutions as the situation is now.
Okay, let's just hold that thought. I'm going to come back to you in a minute talking about the immediate future, but I must say a big thank you to everybody who's joining us for this first SIGA-Soccerex webinar. Just the small topic of where football goes. Now you can see our esteemed panel members who are here to try and answer some of the questions. And Michele Centenaro, General Secretary of the European Club Association, EMANUEL MACEDO, the MEDEIROS, CEO of SIGA, Jonas BAER-HOFFMAN, Secretary General of FIFPro, and LARS-CHRISTER, the President of the European Leagues. LARS-CHRISTER, I'm going to come back to you because you're talking about the juggle and there's so many different factors that we've got playing out across Europe at the moment. FIFA's Chief Medical Officer, Michel Doug, yesterday said, let's not bother with the end of this season. Let's wait until September. Given there's so many difficulties, why not just do that? Isn't that the fairest, most, it's not problem free, but there is an argument for that.
I think he should have kept that advice for himself, to be honest. Because he obviously doesn't understand what's going on in the individual countries. And I think it's difficult for somebody who is not actually the core representative of FIFA, for example, to make such a statement, because it will not be his personal view. It will be a FIFA statement when he does. And I think it could be a very expensive statement, for example. If, for example, there are opportunities for a country and a league in a country to finalize the current competition, it will guarantee the integrity of the competition. It will guarantee the integrity of the international competitions, because clubs will be qualified on sporting merits and not by decision in front of a desk. So I think everybody of the stakeholders in Europe are in favor of finalizing the current season, for example, if it's possible. So that is also the health and the virus has to allow us to do that, but that would be the best way. If we can't do it, then we have to find another solution.
Kelly, is that something that the clubs and the leagues are united on?
I would definitely say so, but let me just comment first on taking leadership. I've been experiencing now football for some time, and I think in the situation like this, where I completely agree, everyone was kind of unprepared to take this shock, sort of. I really felt an unprecedented sense of unity and urgency and commitment, and also leadership, in particularly from the two main institutions, FIFA and UEFA, who are actually very much, they have singled out the problems. They reacted and responded very quickly. They, for the first time, as I say, properly and transparently got together clubs, leagues, and players, and leaving aside every single individual interest, we are trying to reach a solution. It's not easy at the moment. There are more questions than answers. And this level of uncertainty is actually what's worrying the most. But especially clubs. Clubs have to plan. They have to think ahead. They have to look at the survival of their own club. Let's be clear about that. So they need certainties. But these certainties are not available yet. It's nobody's fault. It's not easy. But I think there is a really a common understanding with the leagues that it's important to resume football, and it's important to try and finish what's not finished, also from a sporting merit point of view. As long as this is safe and possible, again, I think this is the key principle. And then there will be time for bigger questions, but maybe we should already now start asking ourselves these questions. maybe something like, are there lessons that we have to learn here? For example, we should probably plan for rainy days. Football has been flourishing over the last 30 years, and all of a sudden we are caught off guard with a major thing, but still, maybe there was a way to safeguard, reserve somehow what's now missing. Is business as usual going to be still called business as usual? I think these are the big questions that we need to face, but it's already worth starting putting the questions now.
What percentage of clubs, there's a lot of talk, isn't there, about the number of clubs in difficulty, in danger of going bust. Can you put a figure on it? If we look at European football, what percentage of clubs are we talking about here in danger of going bust?
It's difficult for me to give you a figure. What I can say is that we have, in our association, we count 236 members. They come from from the 55 European countries, and we have received, I can tell you, a lot of messages, a lot of signals, a lot of requests that their situation is really critical. And again, this uncertainty is making the thing even more difficult. There is a huge request for liquidity from at least half of them. And this liquidity and the fact that UEFA recently was able to distribute some funds, important funds, almost 70 million, has been kind of, for many of them, a breath of air, a breath of fresh air. So difficult to calculate, but a very high number is out there waiting and trying to, how to say, turn off the tab of their costs and losses.
Could I come in there, because I think there's an important connection that we need to just make when it comes to the economics of how this will play out, and what LARS-CHRISTER was commenting on with regards to the return to play requirements. Of course, if there is a safe way that allows us to return, that's in everybody's best interest. And where I would agree is that it's very challenging in these times where none of us really know what will happen in 2 weeks or in 4 weeks or in 6 weeks, to make statements about what should be the case for the next 4 months. I think that's putting a challenging proposition out there, because none of us know what testing capacities will be available in 8 weeks from now. None of us know what this may open up in opportunities also for smaller markets to find ways to return to their activities. But what's important, I think, is that right now we're talking about some of the bigger leagues being in a position to put together protocols, how they think they can resume competitions. And of course, this comes down essentially to an exercise by which, to the best of the scientific ability, we can ensure that when people meet physically on the field, number one, we can exclude the risk as far as science allows us to, that they're contagious and that they're infecting other people. And second of all, it comes down to where any given country is in terms of their overall crisis management, whether it is socially acceptable to return to football and to divert resources towards football, which are maybe missing in other places. And LARS-CHRISTER is right, that point may be reached in different countries at different times. And that opportunity is something we should try to get to. What is important, though, is we have to face a little bit of a long-term scenario here. These return to play testing protocols and all of this is not just relevant for saving what is maybe left of this season. It'll be relevant for the next season. It might be relevant for a very long time, because the only point when we can really get away from these thoughts is when somebody finds that vaccine, hopefully 3-4 companies at the same time, so that we can spread it faster. And when people are getting those shots across the world, because there is, of course, a connection to what Michael is talking about here, that all the scientists that we talk to are forecasting that in terms of mass gatherings inside of stadia, that will most likely not be possible until people have been vaccinated. Which means we might not just be talking about the economic losses that we're feeling right now which are hitting football. We might be looking at up to a full season next year that might be played without spectators. And of course, when you look at smaller leagues like the ones that also LARS-CHRISTER is representing here in Europe, but also in other continents, where broadcasting is not a substantial income stream, that puts the business model at risk. And therefore, these procedures are so important that we establish them the right way, that we communicate well about it, because the worst thing that could happen is that somebody moves quick, returns to football, and it fails because we're creating a hazard for the players and thereby a bad example for the society, and we're shut down for even longer. And that's why this is really crucial that the stakeholders are working closely and they're communicating with the public about how this is possible, that they're getting the advice from the experts on how it is really safe, and we're mitigating that risk as far as possible so that it is a safe environment that allows us to build this long term and not just now this week or in 2 weeks or in 4 weeks. We need to think longer term in this.
Yeah.
LARS-CHRISTER, is there enough of the longer term aspect being discussed?
Yeah, I think so, because I'm coming back to what I said before. We have to solve the matters which are standing just in front of our eyes also. Because if we should have a long-term discussion and talking about what's going to happen, for example, like what Jonas is saying, if we should have a full season without spectators, for example, this is a scenario where there will be hardly any professional players left in many of the professional leagues, because without any income, it will not be possible to organize the competitions. So that is also why it's so important to try to resume the current season if it's possible. So I think we have to concentrate on solving the matters right now. And I'm also talking on behalf of the 900 clubs which are members in our leagues. And of course, it is probably not as crucial for the 20 biggest clubs in Europe, but definitely, as Michele said, also the majority of the clubs, they have real challenges financially, and I don't think that we are able in Europe, at least, to find one solution which is fitting all the different scenarios in the different countries. So most of these matters, they have to be solved country by country, league by league, association by association, together with their clubs. This is where the actions have to take place. And it's not only the big leagues working with protocols. We are coordinating that in the European League. So all leagues are trying to find ways and proper ways of resuming the games and coming back to football, even if it's without spectators, for example. But this is the work which is going on now and which we have to get in place, I think, to be safe for the future and to be able to discuss long-term solutions.
And that, of course, raises questions about the European competitions, the place of international football, which we will come on to. But Emmanuel, let me just come to you in terms of where we are with the financial difficulties that football are experiencing and the financial pressures that are really leading to the urgency for these decisions to be made in terms of the resumption of the game. How much of a surprise is that the state football is in to you?
As you know, probably I'm one of the few that knows what it is to run a club, to run a national league, and to run a set of leagues, the European and World League Association. And now with a different complementary perspective of things. And I think it's obvious that for what we have just heard here, there is reconfirmed assurances that all the key stakeholders are working together to put in place the immediate, the medium term, and the long-term solutions. And I'm very, very encouraged by listening to LARS-CHRISTER, to Michele, and to Jonas, because they represent truly the industry. So this is a very positive sign, and I think this is a first conclusion. But let us not fool ourselves. There will be less money. There will be less money. Clearly this year, clearly next year, and then we'll see how it will evolve. But there will be less money resulting from players' transfer fees. agents' commissions, players' wages, broadcasting deals, sponsorship deals. We already feel it. Here, where I am in Lisbon, the two main broadcasters have informed the league that they will not pay what they were due to pay in terms of broadcasting payments until football returns to the pitch. Now, this has a huge structural, colossal adverse impact. Then we'll have a domino effect from league to clubs, from clubs to players, and from players to their own families. So obviously, there is a legitimate interest, I would say, stress to return to the pitch so that the ball can return to the stadiums and we can deliver entertainment and sport to people. But also the pressure from the broadcasters, from the sponsors is huge. So I agree with my dear friend Michel Doc that we need to be prudent. But again, those who are at the forefront, they leave the problems in a completely different way from those who are just analyzing from a theoretical standpoint. And we need to understand that. Less money means also that clubs will be in a much more vulnerable position than they were already before. It is clear that for many clubs, the risky practices that they were following, creating spiraling in debt year after year, has left them in a very precarious situation. We know even some big clubs and the way they manage to balance their books. It's not stable. So there will be an impact. And I think that the sooner we realize all this, seizing the fact that we have in front of us at the moment, leading these organizations, people with experience, with goodwill to find solutions and compromises, I think there is a reassurance that we can overcome this less positive phase. Not just football. Take, for example, the NBA. They announced a loss of gate income of $500 million. So it's whole sport that is facing this unprecedented crisis. And let me give a step back, because when I say football and sport in general are more vulnerable because of the financial difficulties that they are facing, I mean also they are more vulnerable to unscrupulous individuals and criminal organizations that are more active than ever, taking advantage of this adverse situation. And that calls for concerted action, strong leadership, with governments also supporting clubs so that they are shielded against these threats. And that is another story, but a very urgent one.
Amanda, can I simply add one other dimension to this economic discussion or financial discussion, which of course is still very relevant and is present there, but I think the clubs, they also have there is also a social impact dimension here. As we know, clubs are really the bedrock supporting local communities. They are a reference point for social cohesion. They belong to the livelihood of millions of people, of fans. And I'm not only talking about the top clubs, the top part, but also the bottom ones. They're really part of the society. Football in Europe is a culture, is social. So that's why I think, aside from the financials, which are important, and we agree, but maybe they impact mostly the top clubs, it's important to try and resume football again in a very safe way, to bring back football to the people. Football has been so fortunate. It has received a lot from everybody, from all the people. It's important to try and give it back to people as soon as possible because they deserve it. The social dimension, for me, this is really key.
I'll pick up then on the point that I mentioned in passing earlier. If understandably at the moment there is the focus on the clubs, where does this leave the likes of the Champions League, the European Championship? What does it mean for international football? I maybe come to you, LARS-CHRISTER, with that one first.
Yeah, there is a knock-on effect, of course, from domestic competitions to the international ones. And there should be a proper sporting merit deciding which teams should play in the international competitions, also to safeguard the integrity of the international competitions. So for the time being, we are planning of trying to squeeze in the rest of the season 1920 in the month of August. If that would be possible, I think it would be fine, because that would also mean that we can safeguard the integrity of the final phase of the current season of the international football. But of course, we have to take decisions about that at the end of May, at least, because otherwise it will probably not be possible to squeeze it in, and also to qualify the clubs for the new season.
Can you foresee a scenario where next season does not kick off?
I would rather see a scenario where the current season is not finished than not kicking off the new season, to be honest. But I think this is exactly where we have the problems with this big uncertainty. And I think we learn more week by week when it comes to testing facilities and when it comes to decisions made in the different countries, the different authorities. So I think we should wait with that final decision until the end of May, actually. We don't have to take decisions when we don't need to make them.
If I may come in here quickly, first of all, I think it's obviously, it was the prudent decision to prioritize the ability to finish the domestic club competition right now, not only because organizationally, in terms of the national management of the crisis, is more likely to have a good chance, but also, of course, they represent the financial bedrock, and as Michele said, also the social cohesive factor for football across the world. So I think that was the right decision, obviously, and it was, of course, it required strong leadership from UEFA, especially in this case, to step back and give that priority, and that was very important. At the same time, and I want to use that opportunity to spin maybe a little bit into the women's game, which in this period is unfortunately a little bit forgotten. National team football is essential, not only for the public attention to the women's game. We've seen the great reactions to the last World Cups and European championships and other continental championships. It's a critical building block for the public's appreciation of this part of our sport, but also for players. I mean, there are so many stories of players who've built their careers for years and years on the appearance in one of those tournaments. Because if you're coming from one of the countries where you don't have strong national clubs or leagues, it's just very hard to be seen. And for the players to be looking now at the delay of these competitions and potentially for another longer period of months without having the ability to perform for their country is very significant from a career building exercise, but also many of the female players are financially reliant on part of their compensation coming from the national federations for representing their country. There are central contracting schemes that don't exist in the same way in most of the men's game, and they're essential for the players, and they're essential for the game. So that balance between club and country is critical, that we find a good solution for it. But of course, we have to be honest to ourselves. We're completely in the hands of public authorities here, in terms of whenever anybody is allowed to get on a plane again and travel to a foreign country to play a game.
So players that you're talking to, are the majority of their concerns financial, or are they health related in terms of the safety, getting on a pitch? What is the balance here where the players stand at the moment?
All of the above. I would give you a list of things. Of course, there are real worries about infection risks. There are worries about what that means for their families and friends that they engage with. They are worried very much that they represent something in society that might give a bad influence. They are worried that football maybe resuming under poor conditions may lead to actions that are not healthy for other people, because they may see it as an example. So the communication with the general public is very important to them. But of course, there are economic concerns which are substantial. Like I said before, most players that we represent are 1,000 to maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 euros, dollars, whatever currency a month. So for them to lose 2-3 paychecks is as bad as for most other people in our societies. So of course these are very severe, but what we sense is that there's actually a very healthy appreciation for that balance that needs to be struck. And they understand their responsibility to not be representing a negative example, but they also understand that, we need to find ways to make this safe so that we can resume. But what I would also like to not underestimate is the psychological stress that this is putting on them. So we've surveyed recently players, and we compared it to studies that we'd done before the crisis, and the symptoms of anxiety and depression amongst players have doubled since the outbreak of the crisis. Now, again, that will probably be similar for the general population, but it shows that there are incredible concerns that we need to take serious just as human beings. Whether they're football players or carpenters, doesn't really matter. And as society, we need to find ways to help these people to get through this and come out strong.
I think it's very important, if I may intervene. It's very important what Jonas is saying, because normally we focus at the top of the tree. We focus on the big clubs, on the big players with the big wages, and on the star system. But that's not the rule. The rule is players who have average wages and live with difficulties, and sometimes they don't get their salary at the end of the month, which forces them to live, I don't know how, for months sometimes. So it is important also that the governments have and express the same solidarity from a financial standpoint that has been expressed to other economic sectors. And this is why yesterday I had the opportunity to write to the presidency of the European Union, as well as the European Commission and each member state, showing our recognition for the willingness to support and financially assist sport in these so difficult circumstances, but with one condition. Here, sport understands that it must lead by example. And the condition is that this is done with absolute transparency and with absolute accountability, because this is taxpayers' money. This is not something that falls from the trees. So we need to be very rigorous in managing these circumstances. And I may also, if you allow me, take this opportunity again to invite, to urge, even to challenge governments to do their share so that long overdue reforms can finally be translated into action. We are fed up of talking shops. We are fed up of window dressing. Governments must act, and they must act now, because if it's not for a moment for leadership, then I ask, what is this moment for?
Okay, we are running out of time. I do want to take a few questions. So briefly, just before we do that, I'm going to go and do the rounds and ask you all, gentlemen. Gianni Infantino has talked about a totally different football when it resumes. Lars-CHRISTER OLSSON, how much do you agree with that? Briefly, if I can ask you, what do you see that as?
No, I don't think the football and the game itself will definitely not be different. And football will move forward also after this crisis. So I think, but there are some learnings to do, but that the necessary tool for that is to start by making a proper analysis.
Yeah, Michele, how much of a gauge of where we are and where we will be can we actually get at the moment, because there is still the unknown of how long this goes on for?
Yes, and as I said before, this uncertainty is really the killing point at the moment for everybody. But I think the question, I mean, the point that Gianni Infantino is making is probably addressing one of the big questions, the big lessons that we have to address. And whether the game is going to change or not, whether the business model is going to change or not, whether there's going to be a need for less is more concept in the future, this is something we have to ask ourselves. So I'm sure that football will stay and survive, but maybe there are lessons, and maybe the game will not be exactly the same.
Jonas?
Well, look, football's football, and football is probably more my 8-year-old son who spends every day in the shutdown shooting goals in the backyard than what we're talking about. That is ultimately much stronger than any of the commercial constructions that we create. I would try to look at the statement in a positive way. I guess it would be problematic if football did look the same, because that would mean we would have not used the opportunity to create positive changes. If it was the same of what we have, just smaller, as people alluded to, and Michele lastly said now, and we try to apply the same rationales and the same logics and same business interests to just less money, then probably we would have failed. I think if we can make it something positively different, certainly under some different economic circumstances, there is no question, then yeah, in crisis is opportunity, then maybe we can build something out of it. So I think we need to, it's a tough situation around the world, it's hard, but there is opportunity in this to get football and other parts of society into a good place moving out of this.
There's opportunity, but Emmanuel, how confident are you that what you're asking for, what you're hoping for, what chance of it actually happening?
Well, what I'm not confident, let's put it this way, is in utopia. What I'm confident is that this trauma, this biblical proportion crisis, serves to wake up some individuals. If by a totally different football, we mean there will be less competitions that create unbelievable calendar congestion, player saturation, with consequences both at physical and mental level, I am in favor of that. If it means that there will be more stable financial management from clubs, that clubs will finally live within their means, not using some creative financial solutions or creative accountability, but living within their means, in the true acceptation of the word. If it means that there will be more integrity, for example, we will have the famous clearinghouse that I've been calling for 15 years. And Michele and LARS-CHRISTER certainly remember my plea in so many occasions. If it means that we will have a meaningful reform regarding the agents' activities, if it means to have a reform regarding the transfer flows, the financial flows, so that we know where the money is coming from and where is the money going to, and we know the credentials of the individuals. And if we bring order into what seems to be a pretty chaotic financial landscape, where investment funds and tax havens seem to dictate the rule and take advantage of clubs' fragile financial circumstances, if this is what we're talking about as a totally different football, then I would applaud that. But actions speak louder than words. I want to see that happening. I want to see meaningful steps getting forward, because, you know, like it was said here, football belongs to everyone. It's the passion that comes from the fans, the reputation that the sponsors invest, and the legitimate expectations that we have, not only top-level entertainment, but under the lights, in full transparency. And this is the true soul of sport. And I believe that with the contributions of the European leagues, the ACA and FIFPro, we will have not only the possibility to overcome this global pandemic, we will have the opportunity to build a more stable financial future for the sport we love.
Okay, I'm just going to throw a couple of the questions, because we have had a lot of questions sent to us. Harry Eckersley from CSM Sport and Entertainment is asking everybody, do you think major broadcasters should do more to help alleviate the pressure to restart, perhaps by deferring right payments? Michele, LARS-CHRISTER, I don't know which of you would maybe like to take this one.
I can quickly.
Michele can start, and then I follow him.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to be very brief. I think it's a very good question, and broadcasters, also the way they present football and present the game, they are very much part of the landscape, part of the part of the game in a way. And we have seen already quite some interesting and positive examples. For example, in Germany, where there is a very close contact and connection with the league. In that case, LARS-CHRISTER will certainly know more. So definitely the broadcasters can really play a positive role in this, I would say, in absorbing eventual losses that may come out. So there is I think, a positive spin in having a discussion and with the broadcasters.
I think we have already seen that in several places, perhaps not in countries where the contract is just expiring and they are turning into a new partner or something like that. But otherwise, I think there are already good examples, not only with broadcasters, but also with sponsors in general. On the league level, where they are having these joint rights for sale, but also on individual club levels, where actually the commercial partners have been doing quite a lot to help in this difficult situation.
Can I comment something very quickly? In my last year as a CEO of the European leagues, the total European football record income was 25 billion euros. 25 billion euros, 60% of which or more was coming from broadcasting deals. Obviously, the broadcasters have a vested interest in saving the business of sport, saving its social and economic impact, and the passion of the sponsors. But that will not depend only on putting money or advancing payments in these troubled times. It depends also on a conscious, active attitude to safeguard the integrity of sport. And I'm sorry if I'm bothering some by referring to the integrity of sport, but I believe that we are talking about clean sport. And the broadcasters need to show the same active stance as, for example, the sponsors are showing. And the broadcasters have been very quiet, very discreet, and that is hard to understand. So my invitation to the broadcasters is that they have now a moment to give a step forward also in that direction, because we need them.
Okay, Matthew Alvarado from SportsCred asks, do you think it will become more interesting for sponsors to interact with the audiences of players on social media versus the classic television and in-stadium sponsorship? I don't know, who wants to pick that one up? So a different way for sponsors to be interacting.
If they mean individual players, I think it's that's already taking place to a certain extent, but otherwise that will be more difficult. I think it has to be, the cooperation has to be between clubs and sponsors, for example.
I mean, what is interesting is that generally, and that is not just football, that also goes for the US leagues, etc. And people watching this will probably know this quite well, but there has, of course, been a shift in the past years that the attention paid to individual athletes is much more significant than it had been in the past. And that, of course, creates new opportunities. To that question about where sponsors engage now, I think that depends a little bit on the creativity of the colleagues of Lars-CHRISTER and Michele in terms of what kind of broadcasted properties and what kind of distribution plans they come up with now. And again, maybe this crisis does create all of a sudden a little bit of an acceleration of new ways of showing this game. And that, of course, can open doors, but whether that will shift dramatically, I think is very hard to predict right now until we know what's actually being put out there.
Michele?
Yeah, I think, as we said, I mean, there are different ways to look at things, and this crisis offers opportunities. When it comes to sponsors, in most clubs, there is a more and more a very strict and connect relationship. The sponsors are becoming more partners than pure media buyer with clubs. So there is really a close connection. What we have to be just careful here is that by doing that, we are not trying to take ownership of maybe players, which are, of course, another important element. And there is this risk, but any initiative which is beneficial for both is definitely welcome.
We've got another question from Victor Icily from the Qatar Tribune. Following the postponement of Euro 2020, the Copa America, World Cup qualifiers and league, would these accumulated events have any impact on the 2022 Qatar World Cup? And it is an interesting question. It goes back to what we were talking about. How does international football play into this? LARS-CHRISTER?
Yeah, well, I think if the virus is developing in an even more serious way as it has been for the time being, there will definitely be a problem with the international calendar when some of the competitions are moved from one year to another. And then the Qatar World Cup is coming in the middle of the European season, and you have to squeeze in domestic and international competitions. But I think we have to wait and see how that is going to affect the business.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And also what has happened at European level is that we are trying, with all the uncertainties and difficulties, we are trying to sort of rewrite the European calendar to adapt to this crisis. I think the same is going to happen for international football. So there's going to be a moment, I think very soon, whereby FIFA will take the lead and see, together with clubs and leagues, whether we need to rewrite the calendars with some set milestones. So that's, at that moment, we're going to be able to answer the question whether it has an effect on Qatar World Cup. But I would tend to say that probably Qatar World Cup, like the Euro, are the two milestones events that you have to work around.
Can you begin to predict how many years of the international calendar, of the football calendar, is likely to be impacted by this?
Well, probably 2 or 3 years, I think.
I think it's not it's not only how many years. So I think we should not only focus on the when, so also the discussion about resuming, but very much will depend also on the how. That's why, going back to the protocols, I mean, the question of how we're going to play is also determining the when. So it feels a bit strange, but actually sometimes you can play with the protection even if you have a nose injury. So maybe there will be ways to have protection to the virus that allow you to play quicker and then have less effect over the long term.
I think what you need to, I think Michele makes a good point in terms of the how, not just from the perspective of the protecting against spreading the virus. I think there's also a question that needs to be asked whether the format of how the calendar has worked in the past is still the most appropriate way to get to 22 and beyond. I mean, I guess it's not a very unusual statement to say that the September window for national teams is at a legitimate risk. International travel between 211 countries seems rather unlikely. So of course that has knock-on effects in terms of the qualification paths to these tournaments. And with leagues trying to find time when they can play their games, I think there need to be questions asked whether those periodic windows, in the same way that we know them, make sense, whether you find other ways. And let's also face it, I think Emmanuel mentioned that a little bit, we're coming off of a completely over-congested calendar that we've had built already. If we're now forced to squeeze things together, I think it'll force us to review some of those things, because we have an incredible imbalance in terms of how much we run the elite players in terms of the numbers of games, the travel, and all of this, compared to the average player who plays his or her league football only. And that there will need to be some reshuffling how we fit this all together. Again, might be opportunity in that as well to create something more balanced than we've had before and have some protections in there for all the concerned parties.
Okay, well, we are over time. So before we go, I'm just going to ask each of you one last question, which is, there's been a lot of talk about this, using this really as a punctuation mark and a chance to reassess where we are with football. If there is one change, one thing you would like to see happen moving forwards, what would it be? Emmanuel, shall I start with you?
Sure. I would express the obvious, and that is that the scientific community succeeds in its struggle to produce the vaccine, and it's made available to all of us so that we can regain our lives back in normal circumstances. But if you allow me half a second, a big thank you to our partners SOCCEREX and CNN for making this possible. A heartfelt word of appreciation to my dear friends Michele, LARS-CHRISTER, and Jonas for joining us in this discussion. I would like to take this opportunity also to express our deepest solidarity and condolences to those who are suffering, who have suffered losses, or have are struggling in hospital beds. Huge appreciation to the doctors and nurses and all the medical community and all those individuals out there who make our lives bearable and possible. And also to the SIGA members who have supported us in the SIGA Strides Action Plan. And this is boosting measure number 15. Big thank you. And one final word of hope, confidence, and belief that we will succeed. Because if I can stay 2 months with both feet on the ground, and those who know me know that I spend my time up in the air, I think we can prevail and we can score a goal for mankind as well. So thank you very much. In case I don't have the opportunity to speak to you again. And Amanda, brilliant moderation. Well done. Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's very difficult to know how to follow that, isn't it? I feel we're now rowing back somewhat. LARS-CHRISTER, do you want to pick up? I think absolutely. I mean, the health and the safety aspect of this is without doubt top of the priority where we are. If we were to bring it back to football briefly at the end, what would you say, LARS-CHRISTER?
Well, I would say that hopefully the learning of how to deal with this crisis is bringing us together so that we have a more, let's say, a better way of cooperation when it comes to form the future of football among all stakeholders, for example.
Michele?
Yes, I would like to see Italy winning the Euro next year.
We can all dream,
Where's my impartiality?
We can all dream. Jonas?
I think that would be the first panel I've ever been on with EMANUEL where I had the last word. I think that rarely happens.
I'm really magnanimous. Don't get used to it.
Yeah, that's good. One time. No, I think LARS-CHRISTER points in the right direction. None of us know the solutions, but I think one thing that we've seen in this crisis overall is that it showed the value of democracy and it showed the value of good decision-making on government side. Clearly, those countries with good democracies have responded better to this than others. And that's the same for football. If we get good democracy, good collaborative stakeholder engagement, good decision-making, then the solutions we will find. So I think the process is where we learn first, and then the rest we hopefully figure out along the way with the help of experts who actually know what they're talking about.
And don't put lights under your skin, huh?
He's not letting you get the last word. Gents, it has been a pleasure. We have run out of time. Huge thank you to all of you for your time and to everybody from watching around the world. I've just been sent a list of where people have been tuning in from. It is quite incredible, all around the globe. North and South America, Europe, Africa, Asia. We've got Croatia, Kuwait, Switzerland, the UK, Lima in Peru, Brazil, Ghana, Bosnia, Bangkok, India, Azerbaijan, Zambia. I mentioned Qatar. It really is fantastic. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us. And this is just the beginning. The SIGA webinar series in association, in partnership with SOCCEREX, is set to continue. We've already got the next date. The second event is taking place on the 20th of May. Please do keep an eye out in your inboxes. There's going to be a feedback form. Please do let us know what you think, any topics you would like to discuss in the next edition of the series. But for now,